So we get it. Let's assume for the moment we get a Boris Johnson government. On day one, he says, "Okay, I'm going to go to Europe and I'm going to do this, that, and the other. I'm going to ask them." Do we have? I can ask you both this. Do you have any sense at all that the challenge to him comes immediately from those on his own party who don't want a no-deal Brexit? I nearly said breakfast. Or do they let him kind of come up with something? In other words, do we have a period of days, perhaps weeks, where he has the freedom to try to work out what he wants to do? Jill.
So the timetabling is really complicated because we're now expecting the new Prime Minister to emerge, take office on about the 24th of July. And the Prime Minister is just saying that Parliament goes away until the 3rd of September on the 25th of July. So if you thought that the immediate thing would be to table a vote of no confidence in a new Prime Minister and test whether they really did have the confidence of the House, it's quite difficult to do that in that timetable. So it might be that they'd have to face a vote of no confidence on the 3rd of September, which is actually about the last day you can do it and still have an election before we leave the EU on the 31st of October, if you want to resolve things like that. So the timetables are incredibly complicated when you add in the conventional recesses. So I think the Conservative Party presumably will probably want to give him a chance to show that he can do something.
Right, so you don't think they immediately, on day one, as it were, either through some mechanism that they come up with that isn't a no-confidence vote, but you don't think they immediately challenge him and say...
I think Labour might try, but I think the timings are really difficult. The really interesting question is this interaction with... I've just been away for the last few days, so I've been missing out on what's happening. But this interaction with, can the Prime Minister actually recommend that someone becomes Prime Minister if they're not confident that they command the confidence of the House? Because the Prime Minister is supposed to say, "Hi Queen, I'm off, and this guy," presumably the person that won the Conservative election leadership contest, commands the confidence of the House, and therefore you ought to ask them to become Prime Minister. If there's some reason that looks as though that's not right, say you've had some defections from the Conservative Party, and we've had various people who've said on the record before, I won't stay in the party if Boris Johnson becomes Prime Minister. So if you have some real defections, that could be difficult. We potentially have a by-election for which the writ is being moved, and we're not quite sure whether it's going to be, you know, on the 24th, 25th of July or the 1st of August, I think, are the dates in play for Brecon and Radnor show, where this MP who's just been turfed out on a recall has just been reselected to fight it for the Conservatives. So you might think he's probably not going to win. So it's very, very tight electoral arithmetic. So I think there's some very interesting things with the choreography in July, and then some very interesting things on the 3rd of September when Parliament comes back. The interesting question, I think, is whether a new Prime Minister can do anything in August, because the other thing we know is we don't know who the new leadership of the EU is yet. They won't be in place until the 1st of November, so that's difficult. So even if you had a new Prime Minister who said, I'm actually going to go and cut a new deal, there's a really interesting question of who are they actually cutting that new deal with. Do Juncker and Tusk feel they can do it, or whatever? So mass uncertainty.
Before we leave that moment when the new Prime Minister takes over, can I just, it's not clear to me, who actually makes the decision? I'm certainly not the Queen. Is it the outgoing Prime Minister? Is it Theresa May, who we think is a bit gung-ho now and kind of...
Theresa unleashed.
I mean, yeah, exactly. They're relatively gung-ho, let's put it like that. Or is it the Cabinet Secretary, or who actually... Who decides?
There's a sort of strategic rush in the middle, isn't it, where we're not supposed to know how the kind of cookie is made. But it is made somehow. But, I mean, the point is, normally you wouldn't have this type of complication. I mean, it's a totally unique situation. And one of the reasons why I think I can see a route to a leader of the Conservative Party potentially not being Prime Minister for very long at all, or potentially slim chance, not making it even into number 10. And the reason is this: in order to win, promises will have to be made. There's no lack of strategy in a lack of appearances on the media because various hostages to fortune are having to be made. And there are two things that both leadership candidates are trying to do. Obviously, they're trying to win the Tory membership round, but they're also trying to keep some sort of parliamentary majority, both for a confidence vote and potentially to push a deal through, and reams of legislation as well, which people forget about. So I think it's a very delicate, that's the specific point. The broader point is that the different factions in Parliament all have felt that their particular position don't have any reason to compromise. They don't feel that they have any reason to compromise. Those people that think, it takes one of those factions to give in or to have their option cut off for a new reality to materialise. So those people that want a second referendum, although the numbers aren't there at the moment, they can see a path to it. And the path to it would be, I guess, you get to the very point of a general election, and at that point, at 1 second before that, it is suddenly in everyone's interests not to have a general election, and that is coded by being essentially a second referendum for half the population. I mean, you just don't know where that goes, that general election. You can't predict it, you can't poll it, you can't focus your adverts, you can't focus your strategies. So to layer a general election against the backdrop of something that will be perceived to be a second referendum by large swathes of the country, if not everybody, is deeply perilous in terms of how we calculate how to deploy sort of political capital. But I think the biggest strategic point is that just people aren't compromising even in the methods. So the essentially both leadership candidates still think that they can kind of polish, grate a bit of the withdrawal deal off, turn it around, rebrand it, call it something else, and have a slightly better deal negotiated with the EU. I mean, even Boris Johnson in the interviews he's now started to do, he's acknowledging that this way through via the WTO GATT Article 24 will require a negotiation. So no deal requires a deal, and then it requires everything else, and so it's just another deal. So
was that where last night took us? If it took us anywhere, that interview with Laura Kuenssberg, that actually he does now acknowledge that this implementation period and the whole thing actually depends, and GATT 24 depends utterly. It doesn't have to be a long deal, but there needs to be some sort of a deal. So it's not a no deal.
Yeah, GATT 24 is the interim application of a deal that's sort of down the line. So you have to have that deal down the line, as Laura Kuenssberg was pointing out to him yesterday. The implementation period is part of the withdrawal agreement. I think David Lidington and various Conservative colleagues were taking to Twitter over the weekend, pointing these things out.
But that seems to me to take him away from no deal, actually. I mean, he is moving glacially, perhaps, isn't he?
Well, then, yes, but then there comes, this is, you can't shuffle, you can shuffle this pack again and again and again and again. It's still got the same cards in it, right? Yeah. So he does that, he goes a little bit that way towards the Tory pragmatists, you might call them, and then he starts to annoy the ERG. There's a point, there's a point, I don't know exactly where that is, where saying that you can't do Article 24, saying you have to actually negotiate a deal, and you may lose them pretty swiftly. So the same, he basically, his fundamental offer is that I can charm a majority out of a parliament that is fundamentally split on for whom the numbers for a majority for anything seem difficult. And I think this is what is often missed, Justin, which is actually those numbers, and so obviously the Brexiteers will argue it's a rogue parliament, it's a Remain parliament, but actually they were elected in 2017. Okay, they were elected in 2017, and people say 80% of them were pro-Brexit. The Labour manifesto was very clearly anti-no deal, right? Totally clear. So actually, if you apply the 80% logic of yes, it's true. 80% said that they would respect the referendum. 52%, I think it is, said that they would be against no deal. So where does that leave you? It leaves you with the impasse that we have, and I still think you need an event to crystallise some sort of event. An election or something to actually crystallise any fundamental.
But do you agree, Jill, that the results of an election are just utterly unknowable?
So you potentially have even just in England, a sort of four-party election. And the combination of four-party election with first past the post means you can't really predict where the outcome is going to be, because, you know, obviously part of the Boris Johnson appeal, and the reason why he's riding high, is because the Conservatives think he is their answer to see off the Brexit party. And, you know, if you've got Boris Johnson, Conservative leader, who needs Nigel Farage? So they think that that's going to boost them ahead. We've got this battle for who is the voice of true Remain, see where Labour repositions itself, but we've got the Liberal Democrats benefiting from resurgence. By then they'll have a new leader as well.
And they're taking Tory votes as well.
Yeah.
This is quite important.
So they're taking Tory Remain votes.
They're taking
some of the Tory Remain votes. So Tory votes are splitting all over
There's many
the place.
different tribes. This is not a binary world. It's a complicated system where, you know, you take, you know, we as broadcasters, as a former political editor, we went to the north, we went to Sunderland a lot to describe Brexit. There's an equal story, perhaps of more influence as regards parliamentary seats across the whole swathe of the M4. Literally from Battersea all the way to Swindon, there were 10% swings against
So
the
in that
Conservatives.
case, given what you both describe, Boris Johnson cannot come into power thinking it'll be fine, I'll have an election and I will get a Brexiteer parliament and I'll go for it.
Well, he may think, I don't know, I think he may think, clearly that there is a route to get...
Does he not listen to you? Does he not listen to... I mean, what is his thinking then?
The question is, what's the alternative?
If he's sanguine about an election,
well, this is...
thinking?
I mean, you think about him, actually, one of the really interesting things now, you've got Hunt and Johnson, one of the issues structurally over the past 3 years was that we have a Prime Minister, the former Home Secretary, who defined Brexit, having voted for Remain, as being the end of free movement. Now, Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt are probably, well, they're definitely less attached to that, which in theory, if they had full autonomy, would open up some areas of compromise in the single market space, not now, not what they're aiming for, not what they'd ever say to a Tory party membership, but if you're willing to do something on the freedom of movement, you can go there. But I think it's also forgotten, when we talk about the deal, you know, even what the Prime Minister was projecting, say, to the car industry, you know, she was telling Jeremy Corbyn we're going to have no rules of origin checks. The rules of origin stuff is really important, okay? I mean, it's essential for everybody here with us. I honestly think that there are ministers and cabinet ministers, and probably shadow cabinet ministers too, who had no idea what this was about a year ago, 2 years ago. Vitally important to everybody in this room. Now, the Prime Minister wrote a letter to Jeremy Corbyn saying, we're going to have all the benefits of a customs union, so you guys don't need to worry, because we have, there are no rules of origin checks. That only applies, I think I'm right, in the backstop. It's only in the backstop.
It's a very odd piece. It's a very odd piece of the political declaration where they talk about building on this, and we might do a sort of customs union-y sort of thing, and then they have some word about sort of rules of origin checks in there, but it's very. But it's only that's the only.
But it's only in, and the Commission point this out. So in other words, if you junk the backstop, which is kind of common ground, the bit that guarantees no rules of origin checks is essential for car manufacturing with distributed parts around the European Union. If you junk that, I mean, I don't know where you go. So I don't know, you know, so that's quite interesting. And I think the bigger picture, and we've gone into some of the detail here, is the fundamental decision, which is in political economy, against the backdrop of everything we've discussed, is to what extent are you willing to make more complicated, less frictionless, I don't know, less seamless, shall we say, your trade with Europe? To what extent are you willing to make that more difficult in order to get a trade deal with the US? Because to the extent that you want to do that, to the extent that you want to do a full-blooded trade deal with the US and others, then you need to sort of cause some. You don't want to cause any problems, but the fact is you have to basically deintegrate a bit from Europe, don't you? And that is the debate. Actually, it's a trade-off.
Yeah.
And the answer from most politicians that I've interviewed over the past 4 or 5 years is, well, it doesn't really need to be a trade-off. It'll be all be okay. And that strategic decision then refracts back to the European Union in a context of, as has been described by Chris and others, where, who would have thought the economics editor of the FT would have 4 Donald Trump tweets 3 years ago as the lead slides. But, where you have a European Union, and this is really important, this is, a European Union that believes that Donald Trump has he has advisors that want to destroy the European Union, right? So where we land in this spectrum in the Atlantic really matters. I actually think that this is the more fundamental issue. Actually, the Irish backstop is important, totemic and symbolic, and we talk a lot about it. But in a funny way, and this goes to the heart of the political impasse, because the Prime Minister and her team were too scared to make the following argument: we want to keep the car industry with the trading arrangements it has gotten used to for the past 20 or 30 years, and therefore we don't want to do a full-blooded trade deal with the US, we'll just do it on services. That is actually what they think. They cannot make that argument in public. So they focus on Ireland. Now, when you have a situation at this vitally important negotiation where people aren't really saying what they think because they're too scared, you are never going to solve the issue. And that is where we are right now. I think that they couldn't, you think about it, they came up with this deal that was so difficult internally. Did you see the Prime Minister in a car factory with a hard hat? Did you see, it was the obvious thing to do for her to go to one of these guys' car factories and say, I want to save these jobs. She could not make that argument because in order to say that, that would have annoyed some of her own MPs.
But that was effectively what she did at Chequers, because Chequers actually, and you talk to services businesses, and services businesses say, well, actually people like the car industry clearly made a big impact on the government because Chequers was it was designed to do 2 things. One, it was designed to sort of reverse out the backstop by sort of saying, actually, we don't need border checks and we'll have a customs arrangement that means we're effectively running the EU's border for them, so we can sort of, have our customs cake and eat it, and we don't need that. But if you talk to services businesses, we had an event a few weeks ago, they're all saying the guys who do just-in-time manufacturing, i.e. all of you, actually got your message through incredibly well. They complain about the media, and they say it's much easier to send a picture of somebody to a car factory or to Dover and say there'll be long queues, or hear the guys with these just-in-time supply chains or whatever, see these things coming in, see the cars going out. You can't take a picture of a services business that looks very exciting, but actually the people who were, if you take that view, hung out to dry on Chequers were the services businesses, because the Prime Minister is saying effectively we stay in the single market for goods. If we can, we'll adhere to EU regulations. But services, we don't want that. We'll go and we'll just go for the sort of third country equivalence arrangements for financial services. And for the rest, we want to diverge or whatever. Those businesses saying, actually, we've failed to get our message through that we don't want to diverge. We want to stay doing business in Europe, and that's very helpful. And they say you played a blinder, basically, in terms of where you got the Prime Minister. I think the interesting thing is a new Prime Minister will get a lot of that sort of lobbying. So Boris Johnson hasn't probably been particularly exposed to that. He's not been exposed as Foreign Secretary or whatever to the realities of no deal. I think it's always very interesting why members of the Cabinet don't ask themselves, why is Michael Gove so opposed to no deal? Because Michael Gove is at the sharp end of no deal, running DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. You think things are bad for you, but no one is going to have to shoot lambs on the M20 in the event of no deal because of the car industry. You'll just have sort of glitches in your supply chains and annoying things like that. DEFRA is really potentially very badly affected.
You can shoot lambs as well if you want to, but it would be an odd thing to do.
You're not ordering
let me throw it open now to everyone, because we've got sort of 5 or 10 minutes, so anyone who wants to ask anything. There was one thing that we haven't asked that I might just get Faisal to comment on while you're thinking of things, and that is this. Is there a realistic improvement in our preparations, this is with your economics editor hat on, improvement in our preparations for no deal that could make a material difference between when a new Prime Minister takes office and October the 31st?
So I mean, that is a very tight timescale, and we, think Operation Yellowhammer was ramped up and ready to go, but all it was designed to do was to mitigate problems. Mitigate the queues,
So
and of course the problem
products in and all the rest.
And then they'll say, well, we'll only check the certain number of cars or a certain number of lorries, but then how do you decide which ones to check? I think you take a step back from this. Channel Tunnel and the Dover Straits, well, the Dover Straits weren't, but the Channel Tunnel was designed with the single market customs union in mind. As soon as you take a step away from that, things get difficult, but not impossible. There was a time when that looked extremely difficult, but they're going to have to check. It was designed for no checks, and yet they have built a facility. The French have built a facility now just outside the Channel Tunnel, the mouth of the Channel Tunnel. I think if the expectation is doomsday disaster, then you can avoid that. Yeah. Widespread disruption affecting the availability of stuff people buy. We're going to see that. The tariffs, have been published already. There'll be a 10% tariff on the imports of cars. It's amazing changes that were just sort of announced quite quietly.
But not yet approved by Parliament, of course.
Yeah, not debated.
Which is quite interesting, because tariff schedules have to be approved within 28 days by Parliament, or they fall, which obviously everything that requires legislation is very difficult, because we also have to remember, and I think this might go to the calculation on a general election, is that this is a minority government. So it's a do-nothing government. It's impossible to get any real legislation through at the moment. The main thing they're legislating about is circus animals and Kew Gardens, and Parliament is hardly voting. I think there is one thing that you could do if you're doing. I think there's a real danger that actually, having sort of ramped everything up for March 29th, there is a danger that we are less ready on October 31st rather than more ready, not least because within the civil service and government, I'm ex-civil servant, a lot of the people are moving jobs because they've done their bit, and so they're moving on. The Director General for Borders, Karen Wheeler, retired last week. She was absolute linchpin of those border preparations, so she's gone, very relieved, whatever. So you get new people living by handover note. There was a very, very interesting line that the civil service uses, which is, the civil service is ready. And the point we make is that the civil service may be as ready as it can be. That's great, thanks guys. But actually the civil service being ready isn't the same as the country being ready. And they put out a very strange note in February when Anna Soubry asked for them to put out the briefing that's gone to Cabinet on readiness for no deal. And that basically said, well, we're ready. We're sort of going to be ready. But only 40% of traders have applied for their AORI numbers. Only sort of people aren't renewing their passports to have 6 months validity. The moment they told people to do that, the website for passports crashed. So I think it's a really interesting thing that if the government wanted the country to be more ready, and this may be a thing Prime Minister Johnson does, is it actually prepared to go out, not to you, but to the people who may be your sort of subcontractors, and things like that, to SMEs, to say, you actually have to start really getting ready. And you could possibly, like other countries, saying, we will give you grants to do that. So some countries have been giving, the Irish have been giving adaptation grants. We will sort of, persuade you to do that. And we want to get not to 40-odd% or whatever it was, having EORI numbers for customs with a third country, whatever.
That's never going to happen in October, though, is it?
Well, you'd have to crash immediately into it. But I mean, that's the things that you need to be more ready than we were.
Yeah. Gentleman here, hold on 1 second. We'll get the microphone to you. Could it be passed along, perhaps? Yeah, here we go. They're very cooperative when you encourage them. Here we go.
Thank you, Justin. Our industry's made it clear absolutely from day one that frictionless trade is fundamental to continued competitiveness. So border chaos would be extremely damaging short, medium, and long term. Now, Boris dismissed these arguments as like the millennium bug or technology solutions like the Oyster card or the congestion charge, where no one cares where the car's coming from, going to, or what's in it, is the solution. And yesterday apparently said there's an abundance of technology that can fix this. But is there any evidence that this abundance of technology is capable, reliable, repeatable, at scale for 4.2 million crossings at the border at the end of October? Or is it just another pyramid of piffle?
I think that's a slightly loaded question there.
He's thinking with his new BBC hat on there.
There's a limit to what is plausible by the end of October, obviously. I can't see that there won't be more disruption than probably most of the country expects, and disruption that won't affect all of your businesses. I mean, the amazing thing is we haven't really talked about what happened in April. I mean, you were all told by a government, and this is the other thing, were we going to go around with a big advertising campaign telling small businesses to get ready for no deal, definitely on October the 31st, because we really are going to do it.
When it would probably be November the 15th
when
anyway.
You were all told to do this, and half of you brought forward the shutdowns of your car factories, and that's an amazing impact on an industry, a 44% decline in production. It is in 1 month, and we hope that it's made up for later. I don't know if it is going to be. We'll find. Hasn't happened yet. I guess we wouldn't know, would we? But that's an amazing impact of a government, of a free market government, on an industry that has done pretty well in the UK over the past 5 or 10 years. So I think they think that they can mitigate it. They can do their best. I think the message from the civil services, they can do the best, but they can't change the laws of physics on this. There will have to be checks where there were not. And the other thing...
But can they not do the checks that...
So the UK's not going... So there's a real difference of approach between the UK and the EU. And the truth is we don't actually know what the EU will do. So the UK has said it will prioritise flow and continuity, which means basically if we wave that thing through... you have to do the documentation to pay the tariff. But if we wave that thing through with no regulatory checks, the day before Brexit, we will wave it through for quite a long time afterwards. And basically, all the UK's no-deal preparation notices say we'll continue to recognise EU standards, we will continue to do this or whatever. So they give you sort of lead-in times on registering chemicals, things like that, because we haven't got the capacity, frankly, to do anything else. The EU's no-deal notices say the reverse. They say the UK becomes a third country, and we will therefore apply all the standard things we do to a third country with whom we have no facilitation agreements. And what the EU is then doing is putting in place not agreements, so not what we call managed no deal, but unilateral contingency mitigations, and we may see more of those. So where it really messes things up for the EU, they put in place a unilateral mitigation. So we've got things saying the planes will fly for sort of, not 6 months. Road haulage will have a very limited range of licenses for 9 months. So we have those sorts of things which will unilaterally expire. They're not agreed with us, but they're things that the EU is doing to prioritise flow. The bit we don't know, either in Ireland or at the sort of Dover-Calais, the Channel crossings, wherever they're going, is quite how those customs and regulatory check authorities will operate, whether they will sort of say, actually, for the time being, it was okay yesterday, so it's okay today, and we'll just sort of treat it more or less as normal. And we don't want huge, big queues and things like that. We don't disrupt our northern economies. Or will they hold things up? Because within the sort of proper application of EU law, they should be checking normal samples.
Okay. Final question to you both. It's pretty much yes or no. Are we still going to leave the European Union, Jill?
Leave the European Union? Who knows? No idea.
Okay. Faisal?
Not on October 31st.
Not on October the 31st, potentially not at all.
It's a random number generator, isn't it? It really is.
Every time the chance of no deal goes up, and the chance
I'm a
of no
numbers
Brexit
man now.
It just really does underlie the oddness of the situation, doesn't it? Faisal and Jill, thank you both very much. Yeah.